This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a
Hello, my name is Dewana Thompson, and I am the creator of Woke Vote, and I am so honored to be a part of this presentation for Dr. Angela Davis. This means everything to the city of Birmingham. She is a daughter of this city, and I can tell you that in this moment that we're in, this critical moment in our country, it means the world to our community to have a voice like hers that is still so prominent, still so poignant, still calling for justice in this moment. We thank you, Dr. Davis, for your service and your leadership, and we will continue to move forward in your honor.
Global human rights activist, scholar, author, and Birmingham native, Dr. Angela Davis will receive the Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award, the highest award given by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that honors outstanding individuals for their significant contributions to civil and human rights. Established by the BCRI Board of Directors in 2002, the annual Fred L. Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award serves as a tribute to the leadership and courage of the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth throughout the course of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. This annual award is an opportunity for the Institute to recognize individuals for their service to civil and human rights causes around the world. It is the highest honor bestowed on an individual by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Recipients of the Shuttlesworth Award must embody the principles that guided the American Civil Rights Movement and have characterized the life of Fred L. Shuttlesworth. That is, a philosophy of nonviolence and reconciliation. You gotta have courage, both moral and physical, especially in the face of great odds. Humility, gotta lead by example. And of course, you have to commit to human rights activities for the future.
As mayor of the city of Birmingham, today I am so honored to join you in celebrating the life, legacy, and advocacy of one of the strongest voices of equality in our nation's history. A woman who just happens to be a daughter of Birmingham, Dr. Angela Davis. Dr. Davis once said these very profound words that have stuck with me for a lifetime. I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. Look at the wave of social change that has swept our country in the past few weeks. Those words Dr. Davis shared so many years ago were prophetic. Simply put, we're the change we seek. It's that foresight, that passion, that thirst for freedom that has made Dr. Davis an icon in the social justice movement and a role model for so many in the city she calls home. The Fred L. Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award is the highest award given by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. It honors outstanding individuals for their significant contributions to civil and human rights. It's through her pen and her poise, her articulation and her actions, her wisdom and her walk, that we so proudly offer this award to Dr. Davis, a woman who rose from the unrest of Dynamite Hill to become a powerhouse for change on a global scale. How did she do it, you ask? Well, it's simple. She no longer accepted the things she could not change. She instead changed the things she could not accept. Thank you, Dr. Davis. Thank you so much for being a change maker. Thank you for reminding us we have the power to change our destinies. Thank you for personifying the promise of Birmingham.
Without Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Birmingham would not have worked. You're talking about a man who had his church bombed several times, been beaten badly a couple times, been in jail numerous times. Someone blew his house up on Christmas night, 1956. The entire neighborhood thinks that Fred has been killed. He walks out the back door without a scratch, no broken bones, goes to the front of the building and calms people down and makes them go home. He tries to integrate Phillips High School in 1957 with his daughters and these individuals. They hit him with everything. Bike chains, brass. He said the first time he saw brass knuckles, he was getting hit with them. This man goes to the hospital. Doctors trying to figure out why he doesn't have a cracked skull or a contusion. Reverend Shuttlesworth told the doctor, well, he knew I lived in a hard town, so God gave me a hard skull. He checks himself out of the hospital and goes to church meeting. Walks in and is like, hey, how many of y'all are mad? Of course, people are mad, raising their hands. Y'all ready to fight, aren't you? People say, yeah, something has to happen. He said, I'm not mad. I got beat up. I'm not angry. This is the price of victory. And he told people that night, after getting beat within an inch of his life, that if they did one thing, broke one window, he would say, you did it to hurt the movement and wouldn't support you. This person was a great man. He is the reason King comes to this town in the first place.
This is an extraordinary moment. I've never experienced anything like the conditions we are currently experiencing.
Philosophy professor Angela Davis.
Her first lecture drew 2,000 students.
Angela's education is now being put into practice.
There is a conspiracy in the land. It's a conspiracy to wipe out the black community as a whole.
They wanted to break me. They wanted me to respond.
There was enormous feeling for Angela everywhere in the world.
We know that she is innocent.
We want to tell that Pharaoh in Washington to let Angela Davis go free.
What they're doing to her is an exaggerated form of what happens every day to black people in this country.
What does it mean to be a criminal in this society?
Change has always come from the younger generations.
Yeah.
And it's very bizarre that as we grow older, we forget, and somehow we think that we are the ones in possession of all of the knowledge. And we forget what it was like to be young and to respect our elders, but also recognize that sometimes we have to do things differently, and that means we have to challenge our elders.
When these protests erupted, I remembered something that I've said many times to encourage activists who often feel that the work that they do is not leading to tangible results. I often ask them to consider the very long trajectory of Black struggles, and what has been most important is the forging of legacies and new arenas of struggle that can be handed down to younger generations.
Happy Juneteenth, everyone. I am Wendy Greene, professor of law at Drexel University Kline School of Law and the founder of #FreeTheHair campaign. I am deeply humbled and honored to introduce and interview the recipient of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's highest honor, the Fred L. Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award. She is a woman who truly needs no introduction, a world-renowned human rights activist and scholar, a civil rights living legend who personifies the titles visionary, freedom fighter, and abolitionist, Dr. Angela Davis.
Thank you.
Am
I speaking now?
Yes, it's all you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the introduction, Wendy. And thank you, Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And happy Juneteenth to everyone. Juneteenth reminds us that we were at least partially successful in our struggle against slavery, but we still have a long way to go before we can say that we are truly free. So first, let me express my deepest gratitude to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute for offering me the Fred L. Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award. I was, of course, very excited a year and a half ago when I was first informed that the Institute had chosen to make me a recipient of the award. And I won't talk about all of the things that have unfolded since then, but given the awesome work that has taken place since last year, the reorganization of the board, the conversations with the community, the pivotal role that Mayor Randall Woodfin has played, and of course, I'm eternally grateful to Odessa Woolfolk, my most memorable Sunday school teacher, a lifelong friend, and the epitome of what it means to be a drum major for justice. Given all the work of last year, I can say that it was probably a good thing that we were given the opportunity to work through these issues that produced a number of controversies. So let me thank Duana Thompson, my friends, my lifelong friends, Houston Brown, Madeline Core, and everyone who participated in this process. But of course, I need to express my most profound admiration for Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who for me was the first example of what it means to speak truth to power. So I would like to send greetings to the Shuttlesworth family, and especially Patricia and her family. And Patricia, I have such fond memories of you and your amazing courage as a young girl. I will always treasure this award, and particularly its depiction of the world. This globe, it seems to me, symbolizes that every single human being, every woman, every man, every trans, every non-binary person on the planet deserves to have their human rights acknowledged and defended. No one can be excluded from this planetary human embrace, not indigenous Brazilians, not Muslims in India, and not Kurdish people in Rojava, and certainly not Palestinians in Israeli-occupied Palestine. But if I only thought of myself as a single individual, I would have to say that I don't deserve this award. The only way I can in good conscience accept the award is on behalf of all of those who have struggled for racial, economic, gender justice, from other elders whose contributions created present arenas of struggle, my partner, my family, those who are in the streets today calling for an end to racist violence and for new paths toward justice, equality, and freedom. Thank you, Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for those opening remarks, because I think it's just really extraordinary that you may not always acknowledge the extraordinary contributions, or that the fact that you are truly an extraordinary individual and that you're uplifting the community that has situated you in this light. And I have to say that as I reflected on this moment, it's not lost on me that when we think of abolitionists, and usually we're thinking about historic figures who sought liberation from racial enslavement and racial apartheid, which you just mentioned, like Ona Judge or Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, Pauli Murray, Rosa Parks, and countless unsung heroes who participated in the global fight for emancipation. Yet, like those Black American women, you too are an abolitionist in the truest sense of the word. And I just want to honor you today because of your role. And I know the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, as well as the broader community too, wants to honor you in your role as a contemporary abolitionist and freedom fighter. With that being said, I guess we can get started in terms of our conversation here, in part because I know everyone wants to hear about your journey and what you're thinking about this moment and also going forward. So really quickly, in learning about your journey in more detail, Dr. Davis, as I mentioned to you before we got on, there are so many synergies that I found between the two of us, and I truly feel like we are kindred spirits in many ways. But first, I'll have to say, in the words of Frankie Beverly and Mays, we are Southern girls. We are Southern girls. We were both born and raised in Southern cities, instrumental to the mid-20th century civil rights movement. You obviously, as mentioned before, from Birmingham, Alabama. I am from Columbia, South Carolina. I also lived in Birmingham for 12 years. And for me, growing up in Columbia and the village, I feel like my parents cultivated for me in this space truly positively shaped me and my journey. So I'm wondering about your journey. What are your fondest recollections of growing up in Birmingham?
Well, there's not nearly enough time to describe all of the mostly beautiful memories I have of growing up in Birmingham, in a neighborhood that eventually became known as Dynamite Hill. I formed lifelong friendships. As children, we played in the streets. I think about Madeline and the entire Core family, Jeff and the Drew family, Diane Robinson and her sister Carol, Helen Glenn and Barbara Shores, Houston Brown, of course. I would probably take up the remainder of our time if I tried to name every person about whom I have profound memories. But I do want to say that I went to Sunday school and church at First Congregational Church on Center Street, just down the street from where I lived. And I will never forget the sense of connectedness and the vision of justice that emerged from that experience.
Yeah, so speaking of Center Street, I've heard you talk about your time growing up in the community that is known as Dynamite Hill. And in particular, because of the consistent bombings that were taking place in Birmingham by those who sought to preserve racial subjugation and supremacy. And you often discuss about how you lived on Center Street, which for many people may not know was the point of demarcation, right, between the neighborhoods that were zoned for whites and the neighborhood zoned for Blacks. And therefore, if you were to cross the street from your house, right, if I'm not mistaken, that if you were to cross the street onto the white side of the neighborhood, you would be violating the law. So I was just curious, what are your earliest memories of resisting the system of oppression known as Jim Crow? If you can recount.
Well, the last time I was in Birmingham, and there was a wonderful conversation at the Birmingham Civic Auditorium. And I talked about the fact that we played games, and that those games incorporated the resistance that we all grew up with. And one of the games, and I've said this many times, involved us daring each other to run across the street, to actually break the law, and to be so bold as to ring a doorbell so that a white person who came out might see us. It was fun, but at the same time, we were learning when we were very, very young that we had to fight back, that we had to resist.
Right. And I love that because I think you mentioned before there's joy, right, in resistance. There can be a lot of fun in resistance. Not to sit here and say that there are sometimes some downsides, obviously, but the joy in the resistance. And I love that story. And I thank you for sharing that. And just a little bit more in terms of your background, in reading more about you in terms of the community that you have and the village that you had, and in particular about your parents and how it appears that your parents, like with mine, instilled an abiding hope, even in spite of all of these structures that were put in place, right? The hope in transformative change, while still giving you and your siblings the tools to see yourselves as having the capacity as well as the responsibility to be a part of social change. And would you say that your parents were your greatest or your earliest source of inspiration to bring about revolutionary change in the world?
Yeah, I would probably say that. And certainly my parents played a pivotal role. But there were also friends of my parents who were Black communists who were really struggling at a time when Bull Connor controlled the city. As a matter of fact, a number of them were run out of town and had to return to New York. I also remember, I've mentioned Odessa Woolfolk. I remember the role that she played. I remember Mrs. Bell at the at the Black Library. I remember many of my teachers, so that it's not as if I have to search for sources of inspiration. They were all around me.
Yes, I feel the exact same way about my growing up as well, in Columbia. And I think it's so important to think about, the village of people, the people that were right in front of us, who were inspiring us and encouraging us to do great things in the world and to be agents of real social change. And it's great to hear. And I think the importance of that, right? Especially for our young people who may not necessarily be getting the encouragement sometimes at home or in other spaces, but there are definitely people in broader spaces that can actually play that role. And, finally, in terms of thinking about Birmingham, do you believe that Birmingham, we know that Birmingham was an epicenter of the civil rights movement during the mid-century, time period in terms of the 20th century. What do you think is the legacy of Birmingham as it relates to the global fight against racial inequality and injustice? What do you think that Birmingham should do or can do, possibly going forward, if you will?
Well, Birmingham is known all over the world. Dynamite Hill is a location that people everywhere are familiar with. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail had an impact all over the planet. And when I think about the fact that in occupied Palestine, Palestinians created a strategy of resistance that was based on freedom riders who, of course, were met in Birmingham by Bull Connor. And so I think Birmingham will live on forever as a center of planetary resistance and struggles against racism and calls for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And well, go ahead.
No, you go right ahead.
No, I told you I tend to go on and on and on. So,
and I love it.
And I know you have a lot to say in a very short period of time. So I'd like to hear from you.
Bring it on. I love it. People say the same about me. So it's great to know. Again, kindred spirits. But actually, it's a great lead in, honestly, to thinking about the global nature of civil and human rights. Because one of the things I most admire about you, among many things, really, honestly, about your human rights activism is your call for us to be internationalists and comparativists as we pursue justice and freedom and equity. And in our respective journeys, the two of us, and you may not know this, I also have a fondness for Brazil. I think we actually kind of talked about it a little bit, but a fondness for Brazil. The two of us have committed to transnational racial justice work, and our shared interest in particular as it relates to Brazil comes to mind. And so in your experience, could you tell us in what ways you believe the contemporary fight for freedom and equity and justice, and even more specifically, the Black liberation in the United States is different or similar to what we have witnessed in other countries?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that throughout the very long history of the struggle for Black liberation, solidarities have been expressed all over the world. I'm remembering Frederick Douglass's trip to Ireland in the 1830s. I'm remembering Ida B. Wells organizing against lynching, which took her to Europe. So those connections have always been there. I am concerned that while as Black people, we have always been the recipients of international solidarity, we have not always reciprocated in the ways I think we should. And I'm saying this critically because I think as we move forward, we have to pay greater attention to what is happening in places like Brazil. And of course, we are right in the midst of an extraordinary movement against racist state violence, against police violence that has taken shape in the aftermath of the egregious murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and Rayshard Brooks. But I'm not sure if we are aware of the extent to which racist police violence happens in Brazil on an even greater scale. 4,000 Black people were killed last year by the police in Brazil. In Brazil, the police has been militarized, and we are confronting militarization of the police. That is one of the major demands that is included in our call to abolish the police or defund the police, that is to say, demilitarize the police. So I think we can actually find assistance in our own struggles by looking at the experiences of people in other countries and by offering our solidarities. And one other thing, in Europe, there's been an enormous amount of mobilization that has happened over the last period. I'm thinking about a terrible case of the killing of a Black man, Adama Traore, and his sister Assa Traore, who has led the movement against racist state violence in France. We need to make connections with those movements. Because our struggle is global. Racism is a global phenomenon. It doesn't just exist in the US or in South Africa or Brazil. It is all over the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to that point, one of the things that you're mentioning is the really, you know, the roots of you know, this anti-Blackness and in racism throughout the world, and thinking about sort of the roots of that. Obviously, there has been, you know, obviously the transatlantic slave trade and racial slavery and other forms of racial apartheid that connect us and bind us all in terms of our fight for liberation and emancipation and equity. And to that point, one of the really instrumental leaders more recently right now, and I see the picture behind you of Mariela Franco, right, from Brazil, and who was an Afro-Brazilian politician and feminist who was assassinated in Brazil, roughly a month or so before the world commemorated the 50th year since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And as I mentioned before, I really couldn't help but notice the eerie parallels between the two, that they were likely assassinated because of their human rights activism, in particular as it relates to anti-Black racism. And so when I think about the fact that you're reflecting on where we are now and where we're going forward, and civil rights leaders, I'm drawn to your words, and I'm just going to repeat some of your words. You say, no march, movement, or agenda that defines manhood in the narrowest terms and seeks to make women lesser partners in this quest for equality can be considered a positive step. And I bring this up because a lot of people probably don't know about Mariela Franco, right? And many other Black women who were activists and human rights activists. So what are your thoughts about the role of women of color, in particular Black women activists, in civil rights movements historically, currently, as well as in the future?
Well, you know, first of all, I should say that I think it is extraordinary that virtually everyone in the world now knows the name of George Floyd. And his name symbolizes a long history of racist violence. People should know the name of Mariela Franco because she not only stood up against racist police violence. Well, she was assassinated by a former police officer, by the way. She was active in the community, organizing against racism, and of course, she was an elected official. She was also active in the LGBTQ community, and I think it is so important to lift her up as a global symbol. It's wonderful to visit Rio and Sao Paulo and elsewhere in Brazil, Salvador, in Bahia, for example, and see images of Mariela Franco everywhere. I mean, it's really amazing that in the last period, a Black trans woman has been elected to legislative office in Sao Paulo, and we're talking about Erica Malinguino. So that there is so much that we can learn from the struggle against racism in Brazil. And we're not that far away, and particularly given the rise of new technologies of communication, we can be in touch. I did not too long ago a webinar with a number of Brazilian activists in the Amazonas. So we're talking about Black activists, we're talking about indigenous activists, we're talking about people involved, people who combine the struggle against racism with the struggle to save the forest in Brazil, challenging the capitalist strategies of the current president, Bolsonaro. I don't like to actually call the names of people like that, including the person who is currently in the office of president in the U.S. Yeah, so I think we could learn a great deal from each other. Our struggles definitely need to come together.
Right. And thank you for that, because, it shows you the interaction and the intersectionality between the struggles of different groups who may be racialized differently or gendered differently or classed differently, right? And so to that point, I'm thinking even we've talked a lot about sort of civil rights generally, but with respect to feminism, more specifically, because I know there was a time that you may not have always identified as a feminist, but more, in recent time, you noted that you align yourself with an anti-racist feminist agenda. And
anti-capitalist.
Anti-capitalist.
Yes.
I was getting there.
That out.
It's a both and.
Yes.
An anti-racist and anti-capitalist feminist agenda. And maybe you might want to expound upon that for the audience too. And also wondering, what does that look like for you? An anti-racist and an anti-capitalist feminist agenda. And then maybe secondarily, do you feel as if in this moment, the feminist movement is really capturing those two elements?
Well, okay, that's a complicated question.
I know.
First of all, what I want to say is that when I look out in the streets, when I look at all of the demonstrations and the protests that are happening, that have happened and are continuing to happen in every major city in this country, in small towns as well, who are the people who've organized those protests? The organizers of our movement have historically almost always been women.
Great.
They've just not received the credit for that work. And I think that today we are witnessing young women, beautiful, young Black, Latina Muslim women, working class women, trans women. I mean, I could go on and talk about how exciting it is to see queer Black women and brilliant Black women. This is, to me, the most exciting dimension of this new phase of the movement. And to me, that's the feminist movement. Generally, when people think of the feminist movement, they point to formations that are largely white. And yeah, there may be some of those around, but I think the feminism that captures that anti-racist impulse, the feminism that looks forward to a revolutionary transformation of our worlds, is a feminism that is anti-racist, that is anti-capitalist. And I think that we have a lot of work to do because in crises, we often fall back to default positions. Whenever we have moments of crisis, such as the current moment, we tend to forget that women have always been the background, the backbone, and often the real leaders of the movement. We tend to forget that for Black people to be free, women have to be free, and I'm including trans women here. The default position is the simplistic call for freedom of the Black man. And of course, the Black man has to be free. Black men have to be freed. Black men, cis and trans, but we tend to fall back on these simplistic notions. The situation is better now, but in moments like this, we see that feminist approaches help to pull us out of these historically obsolete notion of what it means for Black people to be free. And that is why I am so excited about the new feminisms that have developed, the anti-racist and the anti-capitalist feminisms.
Wow, there are a couple of questions there from that alone that I would love to ask, and in part because what you're drawing upon for me is, the rich body of scholarship that you have produced about centering Black women as we are moving forward. And I just want to take a moment again to really recognize the fact that you're an educator, you're an activist, as we know, but you're also a scholar. And that is so critical, I think, in terms of informing, your activism and how your activism informs your scholarship, and to the point that you're making in terms of not remembering or forgetting, Black women's roles in activism. I would also venture to say that we often erase Black women as it relates to being public intellectuals more generally, and producers of really vital scholarship that lead the movement and lead advocacy. And so I'm just really curious because I read, which is amazing to me, right? That while you were in prison, while you were incarcerated and facing potentially incarceration for the remainder of your life and whatever else may have come, right? That you were able to produce scholarship, that you were able to write in the midst of this very, I can imagine, bewildering moment. Can you tell us how you were able to find the clarity and the inspiration to write during this period of incarceration?
Well, I'm not sure I found the clarity, but I did feel the impulse to participate. And because I was not only in jail, but for the vast majority of the time, I was in solitary confinement. So I didn't have the opportunity to engage in activities with the other women. And the only way I could express myself was intellectually, by reading, writing. I exercised. I often point out that I learned yoga when I was in jail from a book. I practiced karate in my solitary cell.
Oh, wow.
And so because I was recognized by the judge as my own attorney, I sought to be acknowledged as, what is it called? Pro se, right?
Yes.
So because I was preparing my case, I had the opportunity to have people bring in all of the books that would be relevant to that defense. And actually, it was in the course of preparing a defense that many of the articles I wrote were conceptualized. And of course, I put together an anthology together with Bettina Apteker called If They Come in the Morning, which was a collection of writings of many political prisoners. I think that if one looks at the predicament of people who are in prison, and I try to catch myself and not say prisoners or inmates. People in prison, human beings in prison, those who are able to survive are those who learn how to live the life of the mind, those who learn to read and write, those who produce. As a matter of fact, let me just say here, since we're talking about intellectual labor behind bars, that our ideas of abolition and defunding the police and abolishing jails and prisons in large part came from the intellectual work of prisoners. The call for abolition was first raised publicly in the context of the Attica Rebellion. So I don't want to underestimate the work, the scholarly work, the intellectual work that prisoners have done. And I was just trying to do the same thing, trying to feel connected to a world from which I had been shut away. It was the only way that I could contribute.
And so to that point, in terms of being able to use this experience to actually produce this really impactful scholarship and advocacy and activism, you have become one of the early, and I thank you for informing us about the role that those who are incarcerated played in pushing now what we know as a movement for prison abolition, right? And that's in the mainstream media. And you were one of those early advocates for that. Can you tell us really briefly how you believe that the abolition of prisons and de-incarceration really would be fundamental to our freedom, our equity, and justice in this country and even abroad?
Well, if one looks at the fact that in the US, 1/4 of all of the people on the planet who are behind bars are in jails and prisons in the United States of America. The US is responsible for offering the penitentiary, the prison, to the planet. And if we had the next 2 hours, I could do a lecture on the relationship between the rise of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment and the notion of democracy with which we work. And I would say capitalist democracy. But what is certain is that racism has been one of the driving forces. This is why we talk about mass incarceration. It's not mass incarceration abstractly. It is about people of color, Black people especially, Indigenous people have the highest per capita rates of incarceration in the country. Chicanos and the Latinx communities. And I think it's important that we recognize that when we say abolish imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, we're also talking about immigrant detention facilities, which are in large part private and which profit from arresting and incarcerating people who come from places like Central America, countries in Africa, and who are only seeking a better life in this country. Abolition emerged because many people recognize that there have always been calls for prison reform. The calls for prison reform and police reform have existed as long as there have been prisons and police. And those reforms have never managed to create better institutions. As a matter of fact, by and large, they've been responsible for making the institutions more permanent and making them more repressive, in many instances, more racist. And so why do we continue to engage in the same futile calls over and over and over again? We need to reform the police. We need to get the bad apples out of the police. Well, the police department itself is the problem. It is there where the racism is totally embedded. It makes no sense to say, let's just get rid of a few individuals. Let me tell you a story, and I don't know whether we have the time, but
we have all the time that you need.
When I was arrested and extradited back to California and placed in the Marin County Jail, there was a white woman guard who was very, very nice to me. I was so thankful that she would do things like take notes to the women. I was in solitary, of course, but there were women in another part of the jail. She would take notes back and forth. I remember Erica Huggins wrote me this beautiful letter, and I wanted to share that letter with the other women who were in the jail, whom I couldn't see. I could hear them because we sometimes talked to each other at night. And she took the message to them, and she allowed us to yell in order to communicate with each other. I really appreciated her. Okay. I have my trial. I'm found not guilty. I get out and I continue to do work. So I go back to the same place where the jail was located in order to attend the trial of the Soledad brothers. Unfortunately, George Jackson had already been assassinated, but Fleta Drumgo and John Cluchet were on trial. And so who do I see when I try to go into the courtroom? I see the same woman, who was the guard when I was there. And so I smile, and, I don't think I was going to hug her or anything, but, I was happy to see her. And she looked at me as if she had never met me in her entire life. And she went about the business of putting her fingers through my hair to check whether I had weapons. And I realized that the institution had completely changed her. She was no longer the person, the humane person I knew. Institutions create racist behavior. And we somehow often expect the individuals to be the saviors. That's never going to happen. This is why we have to transform the institution. This is why we have to create new institutions. This is why abolition is so necessary.
Absolutely. I this is a question actually that I ask my students when I teach race and American law and critical race theory. At the end of it, what does this world look like if we just get rid of all of these institutions? Is that the solution to these problems as it relates to racial inequity and racial injustice that you're speaking of? And to that point, you've talked about, it's not enough to be non-racist, right? That you have to be anti-racist in order for us to really achieve racial equity. And I think you've hit it on it already in terms of disrupting or deconstructing these institutions for us to have an anti-racist future. Are there other ways that you think that we may be able to bring about an anti-racist society? And for individuals in particular to become anti-racist?
Well, to be an anti-racist is to work in order to bring about change in our society. And that's about changing systems, it's changing structures, changing institutions. It's about recognizing that there's a connection between anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant racism, Islamophobia. But I think that we're sometimes so myopic that we fail to recognize that we can imagine a very different world, that we don't have to find alternatives to prison that occupy the same footprint as the prison. People think, oh, we just want another institution that's going to take the place of the prison. But feminist approaches help us to understand that we have to look at the whole. And we have to understand how we might go about asking different kinds of questions. Why is it that we rely on jails and prisons? Why do we rely on armed human beings in order to guarantee our safety and security? And, if you think about it, it's kind of an oxymoron to think that these uniformed guys, some women who run around with guns, that they are the source of safety and security. We have to begin to think much broader. Safety and security also involves housing and healthcare and being able to recognize that education is important and having access to schools that don't replicate jails. So I think that one of the interesting demands that has come out of this is defund the police. But one aspect of defunding the police is getting police out of schools. Mm-hmm. So if we don't think about the relationship between police and schools or prisons and schools, we don't get the larger picture. We can't imagine new institutions that will address the needs that often go unaddressed by people who are the targets of racist police violence, by people who end up being placed on trajectories that lead them directly into juvenile hall and from there into prisons. So it's about looking at the entire society. It's not just looking narrowly at what we can do to make the police better. It's not just asking how we can guarantee that a few more people get out of prisons. The demand to abolish prisons and abolish the police, and that's the negative side. But the productive, the generative, the positive side involves reimagining the way we live in community in this world.
Absolutely. There are two parts to this that maybe, since I think we might have a little bit more time, that we could go a little bit over, if that's okay with you, to this in terms of replacements and reimagining the world without prisons, without incarceration. What would that look like? And I think partly what you're telling, when you say the question, why are we relying upon these institutions? In part because it has been normalized, right? But you've also mentioned in your work about the fear that individuals hold if we don't have these institutions in place. And in particular, fear of those who are impoverished, fear of those who are Black or brown, just the fear that may reside in individuals and why we may gravitate towards these types of institutions that presumably will give us security and safety. How do we get rid of, and if we can, that fear, whether it may be conscious in nature or unconscious in nature, of these boogeymen or boogie women that are out there that may harm us or that we perceive?
I think that's beginning to change, and I think what you're referring to is the ideological work that has an impact on our very emotions. Those of us who are abolitionists often argue that we can't simply look at the institutional framework and we can't simply think about getting rid of the concrete institutions we call prisons and police. We have to examine ourselves and the ways in which we have internalized those institutions and their impulses, the ways in which we think about addressing sometimes very small harms that are done to us in retributive ways. Retributive justice becomes internalized in our emotions so that our first impulse is to hurt. Mm-hmm. When we are hurt, our instinct is to hurt back. Mm-hmm. And that is what our justice system does. Our so-called criminal justice system does. So abolition work involves also doing that work at an emotional level. It also requires asking how we ourselves will have to change and how, as we move toward the future, we also have to work on ourselves so that we will be capable of inhabiting a new world. I don't want a new world with that is populated by people who have all of the same old ideas.
Right.
And that is that's a feminist insight. The personal is political, right? We can't assume that what we're struggling against is only out there. It's also within us as well.
Right. So what I'm hearing from you, for those of us who are listening to go forward, is about introspection, right? Reflection, introspection, then action. To act on those things, act on those realities, and acknowledging those biases, those prejudices.
But it's also collective introspection.
Yes.
Because
yes.
you see,
the individual.
We have been so influenced by neoliberal ideologies, by capitalism, that we assume that the individual is the be-all, end-all, and that it all resides ultimately at the level of the individual. But many of us are aware of the fact that our ideas are not always our own. Our ideas come. Look at what happened to the Republican Party. Look at where we are. Look at who is in the White House. Look at this mess that we have. How did that happen? But I think. Feminism, anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism, abolition feminism, this is another term that we use, as opposed to the carceral feminism that suggests that women can be safe from gender violence if we only have enough police and if enough of the perpetrators are sent to prison. And that is not going to happen. So I think actually looking at gender violence, which is the most pandemic form of violence in the world, and its relation to state violence, institutional violence, helps us how to negotiate this connection between our personal experiences and our political experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. And I just really, I know we're running out of time here, and there are a couple of other questions, and you hit on something else in terms of the personal being political. And if you indulge me just a little bit with respect to that, and thinking about how, just kind of segue in a little bit, because it actually connects to all of the things that you're talking about in terms of collective introspection about our biases, our prejudices, and then the actions that result from them. Also, it connects to the broader point that you're making in terms of the over-policing that we see in our schools that then translate into our children being, namely Black and Brown children being thrust into the criminal justice, or what my professor, Paul Butler said, criminal injustice system. And I see this in the work that I'm doing as it relates to what I call the hyperregulation of Black children's bodies through their hair, and the kinds of expulsion, the suspension, the harassment, the stigmatization that's going on in schools, as it relates to when Black children are wearing their natural hairstyles, how their hair is just growing out of their heads, right? And so to that point, it also brings me to you too, because in this work, anytime we're talking about, or people are thinking about Black children wearing their natural hair, and especially if they're wearing afros, that it comes back to you in many ways, right? As sort of the symbolic, this icon, as it relates to your hair, and in particular as it relates to your afro. And it connects to these broader movements as it relates to liberation. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about, all of the things. I just said a lot, I know, but sorry, because my mind is going here.
Well, I know that you do work on hair and the politics of appearance. So thank you so much for the work that you've done and are doing. I actually kind of feel a bit embarrassed when people point to me as having the iconic afro, because I was only copying what I saw around me. And I remember Odetta and Miriam Makeba and so many women who were naturals. And then, of course, in the 1960s, this is how we demonstrated our affiliation with radical revolutionary movements for Black liberation. But since you mentioned that, I'm remembering a wonderful brief meeting I had with a group of South African girls a few years ago. And there was a 13-year-old girl whose name was Zuleika Patel.
Zuleika, yes.
Yes.
And I call her the little Angela Davis. I love her.
Well, I got to spend some time with her and her friends who had, protested the policies at the high school, the Pretoria Girls High School.
Yes.
And yes. I was so inspired by them.
Yes.
Of course, what they wanted was to get in touch with Colin Kaepernick.
What?
Well, because this is when he began to protest the flag and began to kneel.
Right.
And so I had to come back to tell him that he was the source of inspiration for all of these beautiful young Black girls who were standing up against racism. And I think she said something like, asking me to change my hair is like asking me to erase my Blackness.
Right.
And we can all learn from that.
Right. Right. Well, I'm kind of tearing up here because that's such a beautiful moment. And I think once again shows you the connections, right, between our struggles here and the struggles abroad, especially as it relates to anti-Blackness, as it relates to freedom and emancipation, liberation and equity for African descendants and others who have been marginalized throughout the world. Before I cry, I guess one final question really is in terms of thinking about individuals who are observing all of the various movements that are going on. They are witnessing firsthand the limits of the law, not only in the United States, but around the world as it relates to racism and the limits of our lawmakers as well. Also recognizing, the institutionalized racism that is steeped in our institutions, in law enforcement, in broader society. And they're also recognizing that change just takes time, right? Real transformative change and what you call revolutionary change in this world takes time. And are being sometimes encouraged by that, encouraged by what's going on right now, but also discouraged to some degree. And you just gave us this such enlightening and inspiring story about your time in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And I wonder to what extent that you can possibly provide some insight to those who are struggling right now to find that encouragement as they're trying to move forward and move towards racial equity and justice.
Well, I've always found inspiration in my community. And I think that the challenge at this moment is to build and consolidate a radical community. And it means that once the demonstrations and the protests recede, and they will, because we can never exist on that level of intensity. And of course, the intensity was in part created by the fact that we were, most of us were under shelter-in-place orders, and we were witnessing the devastating impact of COVID-19. And we were beginning to recognize, and when I say we, I'm talking about vast numbers of people in this country and the world, that the reason why Black and brown people were dying more frequently, more consistently, has to do with structural racism, has to do with institutional racism. So that when we experience the egregious murder of George Floyd, when we had the opportunity to collectively witness the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life, which came to an end as a result of a cop with his hands in his pockets, a white cop seemingly nonchalantly kneeling on a human being. How could one not be transformed after bearing collective witness to that? But what was most important was the fact that people have been organizing, and especially a whole new crop of amazing and brilliant and exciting young people. The Movement for Black Lives, which is an umbrella organization that includes huge numbers of primarily youth organizations, they are absolutely brilliant. And those of us who are older recognize that the work that we did actually created a new arena for a new crop of activists to develop who have even greater insight than we do. And And I think that that after the era of protests ends, or not after, but beginning now, we have to ask ourselves, how do we actually begin to make these changes? I know that the City Council in Minneapolis is really hard at work trying to figure out how to defund the police and how to create new institutions that will really assist people. And that is what we're all going to have to do. I'm going to say we have to vote, even though I don't really want to vote for the person I'm going to have to vote for. Because that person was very much involved in the creation of the circumstances that have led to mass incarceration and the rise of the prison industrial complex and so forth and so on. But as I've said before, the question is, how do we create space for ourselves to do the work that we need to do to bring about change? And we certainly aren't going to create that space by failing to vote and allowing the person who is currently in office to get a second term. Even if we are not satisfied with the candidate of the Democratic Party, we have to actually take his name when we vote and realize that we're voting for ourselves. This is the question. How do we vote to create the space so that we can go about the process of making changes in these institutions and creating and pressuring those who are in office to bring about those changes? And I think we can do this. I haven't been so optimistic. I don't know. I can't remember. When I was younger, I thought the revolution was happening tomorrow. and now, I don't think in the same terms, but I do think that substantive change is on the agenda. This is the first time that we've been able to imagine that change and move toward that change. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank you for your work, and certainly the work of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute in preserving the history of that pivotal struggle for liberation, that pivotal freedom struggle, more than civil rights, but it was about economic freedom as well. It was about social freedom as well. Thank everyone who has helped to create the space for this current moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think the last question I have for you really may be about the final words that you may have in respect to how you think, and you hinted on it just a little there, how you think this moment is different from the moments before, the moments that you were in, say, in the 60s and the 70s, 80s, and so forth. How do you think this moment is going to be so different?
Well, history never really repeats itself. We talk about history repeating itself. It never does. This moment could have been much worse than previous moments. But I think the reason why we find hope in this moment is because those who are doing the work, those who are doing the organizing, the intellectual activists, the community activists, those who are ensuring that the ideas circulate, those who understand that we have to express solidarity with our sisters and brothers and with our non-binary comrades who are behind bars. They are working on the terrain that was created by a generation of activists before. And I never thought that I would experience a moment when there would be mass calls for abolition and defunding the police. As abolitionists, we always talked about the future beyond our lifetimes. But then at the same time, we say that sometimes these historical moments, these historical conjunctures take place. We can't predict them. We don't know when they're going to arrive. Something can happen. The confluence of the coronavirus crisis and these expressions of racist police violence took us somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But if we had not been doing the work all along, the organizing, the thinking, the conversations, then we wouldn't be able to take advantage of this moment. And I am so excited that I get to witness this moment, that I am still alive to see that young people today are really generating a much more profound hope for radical futures. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart.
Well, we thank you so much. And we are so glad that you are alive, that you are witnessing this moment, that you're a part of this moment, like the moments before, and that you were able to receive this most prestigious and well-deserved award on Juneteenth. And on this day, which I believe is an appointed time that we all can agree is a pivotal moment in the struggle for Black liberation for all, domestically and internationally. So we thank you for all that you have done, all that you do, and all that you are, Dr. Davis, because you truly are a world treasure. Again, thank you so much for spending your Friday evening, your Juneteenth evening with me and with the whole virtual audience. And again, congratulations on receiving the Fred L. Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award.
Thank you very much. And I just have to, before we end, I have to say that this morning I participated in a demonstration at the Oakland port. The union, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, shut down all of the ports from Canada to Mexico on Juneteenth in order to make a statement against racist violence. And it was, I'm so still filled with the energy of the thousands of people who were there at the Oakland port this morning.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think that's such a great moment, great thing to reflect on, because it's exactly what you're talking about in terms of, mobilizing and organizing to be ready and prepared for this very moment. And also the really momentous steps that lots of individuals, individually and collectively, are making to celebrate and also to recognize this very pivotal moment in our history. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing all of your journey with us. Not all of it, but some of it with us this evening. I really
appreciate it. To all my friends in Birmingham, I really look forward to the end of these shelter-in-place orders so that I can actually visit my hometown.
Yes. Well, I think that another celebration is in order in Birmingham. Would you be open to that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I'm known to be a party planner, so wonderful. So we look forward to seeing you in Birmingham and celebrating some more in your honor.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Okay. Bye.
Hello, I'm Denise Gilmore, and I'm serving as Special Director of Transition of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Thank you for joining us for the Shuttlesworth Award event honoring Dr. Davis. We invite you to help us continue the work for civil rights through racial justice by becoming a member or donating to our work. You can find us on our social media platforms to stay connected with us. Thanks again for your support.